Want to join us in that? Recurring alarm once a day is a pretty easy way to connect and share in those ways. Having made all those announcements, now I will transition toward the message portion. And if you were to go back and look maybe at the last early months, actually, early in October, we had a few weeks where we've been studying through the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 20 and 21, and we've been looking at some of these events near the end of his Jesus' earthly ministry, where he comes in the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. We saw him be challenged by the leaders while he's teaching in the temple, asked about, by what authority are you teaching these things? And as Jesus is being challenged, the dynamic is clear. The leaders and the religious people are ready to be done with Jesus. They want him out of the picture by whatever means. And so they're coming at him, trying to get him to trip himself up in some kind of statement. Jesus doesn't answer their questions, however, per se. He gives them parables as answers and as indirect answers. And he talks about a parable of two sons being asked by their father to go work in a vineyard. One saying no and then doing it. One saying yes but then not. A parable about a vineyard owner who leases his vineyard out to wicked tenants who kill his messengers and slaves and even his son. And then he tells a parable that we didn't look at of a wedding feast, a banquet that's prepared by the king, where all of those who are invited decline because they have better things to do. And all of these parables are actually very much about the people toward whom they are being told. The religious leaders and the Pharisees. And it becomes more and more clear to them that Jesus is not going to get tripped up and trapped by offering himself freely through their inquisitions. But the mission is still the same. These people want Jesus out of the picture, and so their method has to change. And that's where we pick up in Matthew 22, starting in verse 15. If you want to follow along on the screen or in your Bible. Then the Pharisees went and plotted to entrap Jesus in what he said. So they sent their disciples to him, along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with truth and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us, then, what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. Then he said to them, "Whose head is this, and whose title?" They answered him, "The emperor's." Then he said to them, "Give, therefore, to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard this, they were amazed, and they left him, and they went away. So I heard this joke, a Republican, a Democrat, and a priest walk into a bar. And the bartender says, "Corey, you can't tell this joke in church. You know how divided people can be, in church especially, over the hot button topic of walking into a bar." You thought I was going a different direction with that. No, the idea of religion and politics really, in our ways, aren't something that we like to conventionally mix together. It serves usually as a deterrent of sorts, if it's not carefully done. And whether religious or political, this exchange about Caesar's coin raises questions about obedience, loyalty, and authority all of which demonstrate how faith does have an inescapable political dimension to it, but not necessarily a partisan dimension. This text invites us to kind of ponder our connection with city authorities. And if read superficially, this passage can easily be misconstrued into the Bible's ultimate endorsement of blind patriotism. Give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's. And so to read this carefully and to observe this text, we have to be able to see beyond a binary either-or option that seems to be presented in front of Jesus. The Pharisees and the Herodians, these two groups of people, as they come together, we've seen what their tactics were before was to accuse him and ask him questions to try and get him to trip himself up. Now they come and butter him up like a roll. Man, leader, we know that you are sincere and you're full of truth and you would never regard people with partiality. They're giving him all these things. They're making him feel good about himself. And then they try and turn the situation on its head. Soaking him in flattery on the front end, they then ask, so you tell us, person who knows everything, is it lawful to pay this tax? And just as it might be uncomfortable for modern hearers to talk about religion and politics in the same vein, the immediate context of this passage makes it really clear that Jesus was also in a really difficult position. These taxes that they're talking about weren't just typical everyday taxes. In fact, these were taxes in Jerusalem that would have been paid to Rome. They would have been paid to a foreign occupying force, which makes this important because as Jesus kind of hones in verse 19, he has them bring him the coin that they use. And we're told that they bring him what is called a denarius. This was not just a Roman tax, but this was a Roman tax that had to be paid in Roman currency. And so Jesus asked, well, what does the currency look like that this tax has to be paid in? And they show him the coin. And if you were to look at one of these coins, you would see on one side it would have had an imprint of Caesar Tiberius. And on the other side, it would have had him sitting on his throne in priestly robes, along with the phrase, Caesar Tiberius, son of the divine Augustus, high priest. The inscription on this coin actually helps us to see why this tax may have been so controversial in the first place. Now, taxes aren't ever popular. They're not then, they're not now, and they won't be in the future. Especially taxes that are having to be paid to a foreign occupying force. Right? There's a reason July 4th is celebrated in America as a day of noteworthy independence. And so from the start of this encounter, we are made aware that these people are simply trying to set a trap. We're made to know that on the front end. The group described as setting the trap are a group of Pharisees, disciples of the Pharisees, and Herodians. And if you don't know a whole lot about these two, that's okay. The one thing you need to know is that when it comes to the tax issue, the Pharisees and the Herodians would have pretty much been diametrically opposed on their stances. The Herodians derived their power from Rome. And so Herodians were loyal to this tax and would have insisted that, yes, this should be paid. Whereas the Pharisees are loyal to the law, and they see this blasphemous coin, and they're insistent upon, no, this tax should not be paid. It's pretty clear. Jesus is 100% being put into a no-win situation. So, if Jesus says, do not pay tax to the emperor, the Romans will get him for treason. If he says, yes, we should pay taxes to the emperor, his own followers in that region will disown him, call him a traitor. However, Jesus' answer regarding the emperor's coin and the things that belong to the emperor is a profound testament to the heart of faith. We belong not to Caesar or the emperor or the government. We belong to God. We don't belong to our earthly possessions and our material goods. We belong to God. We don't belong to a political partisan party that we might vote on during an electoral season. We belong to God. We don't belong to the demands of our jobs, the demands of society, the secular world. We belong to God. And while Christians may have to pay the emperor tax, this does not mean a neat division of loyalties that ends up giving the emperor more than the emperor is due. Instead, our greatest loyalty is to the one who made us. It's firstly to God. And to give things of God to God is, on the front end, to testify that all creation belongs to God. And secondly, to then place in a subordinate context all the things that belong to the emperors and Caesars of this world. So the trap is set, and Jesus doesn't fall into the trap. Instead, he simply asks them to show him the coin. And in doing this, it's his opponents, not him, who actually have to touch this blasphemous coin. He's just looking at it. And when he turns the question back on them, they're silenced. They're amazed. They have nothing else to say, and they leave him alone. Yet we might be left wondering, what does it mean to render to Caesar what is Caesar's? Does this mean pay nothing to Caesar because everything actually belongs to God? Or does it mean pay to Caesar because earthly authority is different than heavenly authority? Or are we maybe left without a clear answer because the subject of payment is actually very secondary to something else going on here? The debate over Caesar's tax is another one of Matthew's areas in widely portraying the sides of controversy that Jesus faced. Adversarial, the authorities that didn't want him around, and the power for control between the two. More accurately, the illusion of control for the religious authorities. As they're seeking to maintain their illusion of control, they have to frame it through the idea of obedience and law. They ask him, is it lawful to pay this tax? Which isn't as creative as a question as you might think, because this is actually, spoiler alert, something that's happened several times already in Matthew. They berated him and his disciples for picking wheat on the Sabbath, asking him, is it lawful to pick wheat on the Sabbath? And Jesus reminds them, the Sabbath was made for man. Man wasn't made for the Sabbath. And then they do the same thing after he performs a healing on the Sabbath. They come at him with that very same question. Is it lawful? Plucking grain and healing illnesses bring out an important dimension that underline this coin episode, because obedience to the law should never devolve into legalism, where a letter of the law stands in the way of fulfilling God's will, that everybody should flourish. Now, of course, this doesn't mean rejecting the law or disobedience by any stretch. In fact, Jesus reiterates that behavior that respects the law is the bare minimum. The idea of separating, though, law consciousness versus God consciousness is a lifelong process for us. We just finished studying Step 11 in our men's group. Step 11 of the 12 steps states that we sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God, praying only for the knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. We're contrasting this idea of trying to stay consciously connected to God, God consciousness, and then maybe what we see the Pharisees doing here, is it lawful? Law consciousness. Without breaking confidentiality, a situation was shared in our men's group of a church outside Oklahoma years past that had a young man get up and lead thoughts for the Lord's Supper and began by first saying a prayer for the cup and then went and sat down. And the leaders of that church responded by sending somebody up to the front to go, "Now let's try that again, and we'll do it in the right order this time." As if this young man who had just blessed the cup had made a cardinal sin that was to his eternal detriment, that the whole church was going to suffer for, because the order is so important. And it's this sort of thing where law consciousness and God consciousness don't usually end up in the same vein. But we can see it in real time, and you maybe have experiences like that in your own realm, where you've seen churches default to a law consciousness as opposed to a God consciousness. Obedience to God in this case is a challenge to both live up to the highest standards possible, even beyond what might be a legal minimum. Another one of the lawful areas that pops up in the Gospel of Matthew is John the Baptist, as he calls out the unlawful marriage that he sees between King Herod and his brother's wife, Herodias. And he is not silent about telling them what is lawful. And his obedience to the law ultimately leads to his death at the hands of those who didn't like what he had to say. And as we see John the Baptist in this way, the question of obedience, when we talk about Caesar's coin, touches upon several different dimensions, because discerning how to render to God what is God's can range from mercifully relativizing the letter of the law to fit a situation, to maybe even going beyond the law's demands, and perhaps in a case like John the Baptist, enduring persecution to uphold the law. But in any case, seeking to uphold the law begins with following God's will. Whatever Caesars, emperors, governments that we may have in our lives, at the heart of this injunction that Jesus gives to us is the constant challenge to continually render to God what is God's. This isn't an easy message. And it's not something that you should feel is a simple compartmentalization that you can take home and feel good about. I don't think it is. I think it's a lifelong task. But Jesus' message isn't one of escapism either. We do have to live in this world where obligations, commitments, societal situations are things we have to sift through. But the ultimate criteria of the way we live, the compass, law consciousness or God consciousness, differentiates how we go about. It takes most people a lifetime to learn the difference between who we think, or rather what we think we own, and finally realizing who owns us. And it is in that discernment that we're encouraged by this challenge to not give the emperor more than the emperor is due. Do not give the emperor your faith. Do not give the emperor your ultimate allegiance. Do not forge a relationship with the emperor that forces you to figure out how God can fit into that emperor's pocket. Do not give to the emperor what rightly belongs to God. For what belongs to God is vastly larger than anything that belongs to any emperor we may encounter. At Psalm 96 that we read at the beginning of worship, we're going to read the last few verses of that because it points to the idea of who is the Creator. Verses 5 through 9 of Psalm 96 reads, "For the gods of the peoples are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. Honor and majesty are before him, strength and beauty are in his sanctuary. Ascribe to the Lord, O families of the peoples. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Bring an offering and come into his courts. Worship the Lord in holy splendor. Tremble before him, all the earth." Amen.